Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Maluco Maga of the History Department, for inviting me to speak. Also for Rico Jose. Dean Bacungan was my dean when I was a student at the law school. And I must make of record that Dean, that I was president of the law student government, and Dean Bacungan was the most supportive dean. And I remember, Dean, I'm sure you have had many glorious moments, but the one scene I remember from law school was you chatting on the sidewalk with the drivers and the janitors. You were sitting with them on the banquette, and the students then actually verbalized their appreciation that they had a dean who can sit down with the, with the lowest ranking staff.
Additionally, I was the person who brought Raul to say hello to yung third word. Parang yung ilan sa punong tatay na bigyan No, of course, the bigger person. Gaddafi. Yes.
It was this one, it was the bigger one. Thank you. And also, Marites, I'm glad to be on the same panel. I must say that Marites' work as an investigative journalist have been featured by the Philippine Daily Inquirer in its banner headline. I recall on January 1 of 2012. We started the year with your work. Okay. I borrowed my title from the book of Roberto Unger, a professor at the Harvard Law School. And in this context, it is actually anointing dictatorial power with constitutional piety. Because that was the role that the law played for legitimating the dictatorship. The next slide. And this is basically a summary of what I propose to say in the next 20 minutes. That usually the legal framework for martial law is traced to the September 23, technically September 21 declaration of martial law of Proclamation 1081. When in fact, the real foundation was laid 1 year before in the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus. And I will go into the case that upheld that decision. My larger point actually is rather theoretical and historical, not really legal. My concern is that the best challenge by the liberal lawyers, by liberal legalism as an ideology against Marcos, was that Marcos was telling a lie. Either he was exaggerating the communist threat, he was fabricating uprisings here and there. There was no basis for this declaration or that. And as I will demonstrate, it actually failed to delegitimize the rule of Marcos. And that is why he persisted from 73 all the way to his downfall at EDSA 1. And the only true channel really was left theory, especially at that time emanating from this building. But even left theory had to disguise itself after the Ninoy assassination, had to disguise itself as essentially bourgeois liberalism. And my friends who sounded Maoist one moment suddenly morphed into Jeffersonian liberals. I mean, if you don't, look behind appearances. But they had to do that to win over the middle forces. And that is where the human rights lawyers came in. And that is why I had wished that Rene Sagisag was here. The human rights lawyers formed the core, eventually, of the leadership of the coalition against Marcos. And this is also the irony. It was, in fact, Marcos who looked for an alternative theory, as between liberalism, imported from the West, and left-wing orthodoxy. Marcos wrote 3 books to justify that. I understand, ghostwritten by members of the Social Sciences and Philosophy faculty. I'll ask you later, Malu, for some names. And that, well, of course, the ideological experiment failed with the downfall of Marcos. My examples, since I mentioned that Dean Bacungan was my professor when he was dean, and I have many students here, my examples will really sound dated to you, okay? It shows my age. Next slide. This is from my favorite movie, The Godfather. So I guess the kids here have not seen The Godfather. You have not, right? or you have encountered it as a video game. So this is one line for the Godfather. The lawyer with a briefcase can steal more money than 100 men with guns. But there is actually, that's part of a dialogue. And the next one shows you the response to that. It was uttered by the lawyer of the Godfather, the head of the mafia, Vito Corleone. His consigliere, his lawyer, his advisor was an Irish lawyer who said the line, and the response was given by his son, the hot-tempered successor to the Corleone family, who said, "Hey kid, if you have 100 guys with guns on your side, whatever you do, don't trade them in for some fucking lawyers." So let me have a survey here. Who of you agree with the Irish lawyer who says that the most potent ally is the lawyer with the briefcase? Anyone here? No takers? I mean, that's the ideology of the entire Malcolm Hall. So who's on the side of Sonny Corleone? Who's on the side of the men with guns? If you side with the men with guns, then you actually affirm the classic wisdom of Niccolo Machiavelli. It is better to be feared than loved. And I'm sure you take this in. I think you call the subject now Soft Side 2, right? Yes. It was social and political thought during my time. The first subject I taught when I was a political science instructor. But notice the bottom quote. Never attempt to win by force what can be won by deception. And that is where the lawyers come in. My next slide. This is actually a summary. I don't expect you to note the details, just to give you a survey. Marcos was president, properly elected, as Dean Bacungan emphasizes. Properly elected as president in '65. Served 1 year, 1 term as president, 4 years. That's a 4-year term. Elected the first president to be re-elected under the 35 Constitution. For a second term which was about to end in '73, and then he started getting ideas. And fortunately for him, and I say this deliberately, by that time the student movement was reaching a crescendo. The first quarter storm, the Diliman Commune, and the historic bombing at Plaza Miranda of August 1971, and the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, validated by the Supreme Court in a case I will, for the non-law people, we love to quote cases. Lansang is the case I'll keep on talking about. Lansang versus Garcia. Notice, 71 August, 72 September, Marcos declares martial law. So he ruled under martial law powers from September to January '73. So that's the whole month of October, November, December. So roughly 3.5 months. And then he foisted upon us this totally bogus ratification of the 1973 Constitution. And again, a case I will keep on talking about, Javeriana. Again, just to fast track it, by '86, we had a snap election, Cory becomes president, and by '87, we have the current '87 Constitution. The next, this is my last slide, which is like a chart. The power of Marcos morphed over that period. So, from the standpoint of the person being tortured, from the standpoint of the student whose fingernails are being pulled with pliers, from the standpoint of Hilao versus Marcos. A student was captured, was tortured, detained in Viluna, and then the autopsy report says she voluntarily drank a bottle of acid. That was the official report. From the standpoint of the victims, the power never changed. You know, you get hit on the head, you get hit on the head. Your eyeballs get blocked out, they get blocked out. But, from the standpoint of the lawyers, it mattered how legally you characterize the power. As Dean Bacungan said, from 1965 to '72, he was the proper, duly elected president of the Republic who took his oath under the 1935 Constitution. Between September '72 to January '73, He governed purely under the very clause that I'm so glad Dean Bacungan showed you, and to give you a flavor of the language, the Commander-in-Chief clause. So it's pure military power for those 3.5 months. But notice, by January 73, the entire power changed. Because by then, by legal fiction, we had a new constitution. And Marcos then supposedly consulted the people who said, yeah, we like your new constitution, but please don't put the parliament into parliamentary system in place, and please exercise the powers of the president under the 1935 constitution, and the prime minister and the president under the 73 constitution. And so he ruled under that power until 81. 81, we had the paper lifting of martial law, and he was actually elected to a fresh term of office, fully constitutional, if you just go by the paper trail. And the 6-year term would have ended in 87, except that he was under so much pressure from a popular movement. So notice, if he called for special elections in 86, it wasn't because of any constitutional duty. It was purely upon political pressure. It was pressure from below, from all the protests and rallies. So he called the snap elections. It was challenged before the Supreme Court as unconstitutional, as in fact it was. And yet the Constitution, the Supreme Court bent over backwards, again showing that the court is a creature of politics, and we ourselves as Filipino, as the sovereign Filipino nation, nobody complained because we wanted the elections to proceed. And then Cory took her oath under, she couldn't have taken her oath under the existing constitution then. So she had to come up with a freedom constitution, something written by Adolf Ascuna. He was assigned, you know, in the frenzy of the revolution, they said, hey, someone has to draft a document. You, sit down and write it. So he wrote it, the freedom constitution, under which we were governed until 87, and then we have the 87 constitution. The next one. Okay, I begin with what I consider the real foundation of martial law powers. The illegal arrests of 1971, Teodosio Lansang versus Garcia. It is a series of many cases. One of those arrested is actually present, Gary Olivar. So that's Gary B. Olivar, assisted by his father. Gary, you were then second year college. And you were how old? 19. You were 19 years old. Okay, so Gary was arrested together with Teodosio Lansang. The charge of Marcos is that, well, Gary was also charged under the anti-subversion law. They were charged as communists, as subversives. And notice the liberal defense is that, hey, that's not true. They're not communists. Well, Gary, you can tell me whether that's true or not. I've got to tell you, you know, for me, it doesn't take a detective to know. Teodosio Lansang was teaching here, right? Here in the CAS faculty at that time. He was teaching foreign languages. What language was he teaching? Russian, God's sakes. You know. Anyway, and I won't go through all the cases, but Garcia Padilla versus Ponce Enrile is very close to my heart. And this is the whole series of illegal arrest cases. Garcia Padilla was a faculty member of CSSP, that is Abe Sabino Garcia Padilla, my brother, and in Alpha Sigma. And Abe was captured in Nueva Vizcaya in what the military did was they raided an NBA, well, sort of safe house. And instead of just arresting the doctor, it was the clinic of a doctor, Aurora Paron, they camped out inside the house, and each time someone rang the doorbell, they welcomed the person and arrested him. And one of them was Abe. Abe passed away a little over last year, less than 1 year ago. And I just wanted to mention the historic case of Garcia Padilla. Now, as I will demonstrate later, Lansang versus Garcia is seen as a high point, as a blow against Marcos. That was the favored interpretation of my era. My professor then in the College of Law in this subject was Miriam Defensor Santiago. My other professor for persons was Heidi Yora. So both terror professors, you know. And guess who is more terrifying, Heidi or Miriam? Yes, absolutely. Heidi was more terrifying than Miriam. Miriam was very, very motherly, I must say. She was scary, but motherly. So you can imagine, these two professors were anti-Marcos, and they liked Lansang versus Garcia. So by their narrative, by the canonical account to my generation of law students, Lansang was a good decision. Why? Because before Lansang, all commander-in-chief decisions were beyond judicial review. I mean, how can judges pass over the decision of a commander-in-chief on whether or not there is enough trouble, whether or not there are enough soldiers, whether or not the communists have grown to a threatening proportion? It was pure, a judgment call by the president. That was the ruling doctrine then. And so, for Lansang versus Garcia to say, next slide, that it will exercise judicial review was, for the likes of Heidi and Miriam, the assertion of the primacy of civilian authority over the military, the primacy of the courts over the commander-in-chief powers, and it was very well crafted. The goal of the court is merely to check the executive, not to supplant, it's merely to ascertain, merely whether he has gone beyond the constitutional limits, the limits read to you by Dean Bacungan earlier, and not to exercise the power in his behalf, not to second-guess the discretion of the chief executive. And everyone was singing hallelujahs to Lansang versus Garcia. I will go back to this case later. Next one. Javellana versus Executive Secretary. Look, even the justices of the Supreme Court said that the 1973 Constitution had not been ratified properly. You needed a plebiscite, you need to count the votes have to be secret. All that Marcos had, we were already under martial law, was a so-called People's Assembly with a mere show of hands, and they asked the question, do you want to approve do you approve of the new Constitution? Of course, they all said yes. And do you still want a plebiscite? They all said, no, we don't want it anymore. And Marcos said, hey, we have a valid Constitution. It was challenged before the court, Javellana, and the court said, hey, it's perfectly okay. And one justice said, even in my own neighborhood, we did not have that plebiscite. Even in my own neighborhood, I, a justice, never took part in the ratification of the court. Despite that, 73 Constitution took effect. And notice the logic. This is logic which is squarely within the framework of liberal theory. They said, if the people had staged a revolution and established a new government by arms, would you say it is unconstitutional? And the court says, well, if the people staged a revolution, but peacefully, without force, why should we disadvantage them? We should be equally nice to those who changed the Constitution peacefully, rather than by violence. We now proceed to the... so there are now two strains of reasoning. Lansang, which is highly praised by the democratic forces, Javellana, which was widely criticized by the Democrats, because Javellana disregarded the test of strict legality and replaced strict legality with a test of political reality after the fact, post hoc. And notice that until today, the orthodoxy is that Lansang is good news because, again, Dean Bacungan read to you the 87 Constitution. We codified the language of Lansang into the Commander-in-Chief clause of the 1987 Constitution. Can we proceed to the next slide? The next one, please. Okay. This is what the court said in Lansang. Notice that they agonized over the decision. We had tentatively arrived, October 5, that we may inquire to satisfy ourselves of the existence of the factual basis of the suspension of the writ. And then jump down upon further deliberation, we are now unanimous that we have the power to inquire. So notice that there was a change in the temperament of the court. And for me, that was a mystery. Why the change? Until later on, I read this book, The Diaries of Marcos. When Marcos fled, apparently he left behind his diaries in Malacanang, and someone published the diaries in a book. It turns out Marcos was monitoring the decision of the court in Lansang versus Garcia. And so Marites, what is happening today about the lobbying within the court is old hat. Marcos had a mode inside the Supreme Court, and in Bacungan, I'm just reading from the diaries. It was Fred Ruiz Castro. He says the president had a spy, one of the justices, Fred Ruiz Castro, a fellow native of Lawat, a senior appointee. Castro came to dine with the president on September 16. It was an extraordinary session far outside the norms of judicial decorum and wholly disdainful of any notions of the separation of powers. Something that Marites has developed in her book, I hope with more examples, Marites, and more recent episodes. Castro told Marcos, I think we have enough votes. But he said, if you want more votes, lift the suspension of the writ in some regions of the country, a partial lifting, so that we can get a unanimous vote. The prospect of a unanimous vote had enormous appeal to the president. So what he did, he traveled to Cebu on a Saturday, lifted it for Cebu, restored the writ for Cebu. It appeared on the Sunday papers and Marites just in time for the en banc session on a Monday. So, you know, the timing was impeccable. And this is what Marcos said after he was told that the court was unanimous. The next one. He was euphoric, a red letter day, the biggest legal victory in my administration, he said. It electrified everyone. The weird thing was that the matter at that time was already academic, because he kept on having a partial restoration of the writ, just in order to have a unanimous vote. And in fact, the diary said that people don't know why I am so ecstatic about this case. It is because the Supreme Court already acknowledged the existence of the rebellion. This means I can place the Philippines under martial law. So, notice. Let's jump to the next slide. My first problem. If Lansang was a high moment for the anti-Marcos people, then why was Marcos so happy? Why the gap between the legal imagination, which says that Lansang was good for liberty, and the realist mind, which says that Lansang is bad, is good for martial law? And the answer actually came from Perfecto Fernandez, by other professor. Fernandez said, the court purported to review the suspension of the writ. It did not wash its hands. It says, look, we will review. But it adopted a very low threshold for validity. Namely, whether the decision was totally bereft of any factual basis, which will make it an arbitrary decision. In other words, in order to validate the decision for the court, it will need evidence. Where do you get evidence of a rebellion? You get it from the commander-in-chief. In other words, you're asking the guy to supply evidence to support his own decision, and obviously the guy will always have the factual grounds for his decision. So notice my first problem was that Lansang, far from being a score for democracy, actually was part of the was a great vigor for democracy. I'll proceed to my second. Again, the likes of Yorap and Miriam. I use them in Bacungan as examples only because they were my actual professors who expressed these opinions. Criticized Javeliana for abandoning the test of strict legality. Well, guys, when Cory Aquino took over in 1986, it was also challenged before the court. And what was the reasoning of the court to validate Cory? That's the next slide. It was exactly the reasoning in Javeliana. Cory's rise to power was not due to the constitutional processes. In fact, it was achieved in violation of the 1973 Constitution because it was Marcos who officially won the snap elections. But the people have accepted Cory. and Cory being in effective control of the entire country, the legitimacy of her government was not justiciable, but belongs to the realm of politics where only the people are judged. So notice, if it was so bad and so stupid and so foolish when it was done by Marcos, why should it be so nice when the same thing was done by Cory? In other words, liberal constitutionalism could not provide a solid, intellectually respectable answer to Javeliana versus Executive Secretary. The weird thing is, the next slide, at EDSA 2, the Supreme Court was expected to do the same thing. They would have done a Javeliana versus Executive Secretary, except that suddenly, the next slide, the court suddenly applied, well, pretended to apply the test of legality. The court said that, well, I think we can say that he actually resigned. The weird thing was that they were relying upon the Angara diaries, which were not even presented before the court, which were published by the Inquirer, and on that basis validated the oath-taking of Gloria Arroyo, and of course sealed the fate of our country for the next 10 years. Next slide. So my second problem is, if the liberals are correct, and Javeliana's abandonment of strict legality was a low moment, was bad news, then why did the Cory Supreme Court rely on the same bad theory to validate EDSA 1? Something which is universally applauded in the Philippines today. And conversely, if Lansang's insistence on judicial supremacy was the high moment, then why did the court apply strict legality to validate EDSA 2? But I will now proceed to my third point. And this, I was hoping Rene Santisan would be here, is an indictment of the legal profession. Problem number 3. The worst they can say that Marcos was lying. And indeed he was lying on one point. The next slide. The fake ambush of Enrile. Well, for the youngsters here, the immediate cause for the proclamation of martial law was that Enrile was coming from playing golf at Wakwak, and then he was ambushed on his way out. That is supposed to be the car which was ambushed. And then when Marcos was about to fall in '86, Enrile said, "Oh, we all staged that thing. It was all fake. Don't believe it." Well, he had the biography recently, but apparently he changed his mind. Next slide. So the Inquirer took him up on the fake ambush. But notice, apart from the fake ambush, I think Marcos was telling the truth. Was there a rising left-wing presence in the country? Well, we're talking about ground zero for the growth of the left in the country. The next slide. So we have the first quarter storm. Next, 70. This is the graduation of 1970. For the law students here, the person carrying People's War versus Martial Law, that is Professor Rafi Morales, a cum laude graduate of political science, class valedictorian of the UP College of Law, managing partner of the CC Law Office, the largest law office in the country today. I asked him why he carried that, because the other slogans were a bit milder. He said, "I didn't know. They just passed me a placard and I carried it. And when I saw the pictures, it turns out that was what I was carrying." And then the next slide. I don't know if you guys are aware that there was the Diliman Commune once upon a time. That is the College of Mass Communications. So you will notice that some trees have since grown in that part of campus. The next slide. That is the first floor of AS, of Palma Hall, as I'm sure you recognize, and those are the AS steps. You will find somewhere in the crowd President S.P. Lopez. Yeah, the guy in the suit. And of course, the next one, Plaza Miranda. Well, it's Quezon Hall. They encounter at Quezon Hall, Plaza Miranda. Someone threw a grenade at the meeting de avance of the Liberal Party, almost killing Senator Salonga. Marcos blamed the communists. And liberal orthodoxy says that Marcos was telling a lie. Well, I have come across many accounts from former communists saying that, yeah, Marcos was telling the truth. And that the guy who threw the grenade was actually a very bright lumpen element who was specifically chosen for the task by the highest officers of the party. In other words, for me, liberal theory fails to come to grips with the fact of a revolution, of a left-wing revolution. And the next one is the announcement of the declaration of martial law. And I will go back to this point later. The slogan of Marcos was, "I declared martial law to save the republic and reform society." The saving the republic part is pure commander-in-chief. Reform society is not part of the commander-in-chief powers, which brings us then to the real conundrum. You know, if liberalism really was so delegitimized by the time Marcos declared martial law, why its enduring allure for the Filipino? Today, the rhetoric of the rule of law is a very powerful rhetoric. We continue to romanticize judicial review. We celebrate it as sober and rational, as against the political power, you know, the raw power of democracy. The people are stupid, uneducated, and impulsive. And for me, especially as a law professor, it positions law as a secular religion, and the lawyers as a secular priesthood. But I think there is a gap, and this is a description from a philosopher. He is describing Brazil, but the first time I read this, I felt he was describing my country. The most striking fact about the social imagination of the elites was a particular incongruity between the spiritual ideals they had accepted and the vision of social life they actually lived out. So at the level of professed belief, they are liberals. We are liberals in the Philippines, in terms of our official ideology. But in actual social life, we treat each other as patrons and clients, trade in favors and dependencies. This is fully demonstrated, Marites, in your book, that the official decisions of the court will be rendered as if they were the product of proper legal analysis. And yet, if you look at the maneuverings behind that, it is all horse trading under the table. The formation of alliances here and there. And here, for me, it's almost a description of us as Filipinos. There they showed almost complete disbelief in all institutions not founded on blood, property, or power. Acted as if a moment of personal presence were worth 1,000 promises, and as if any exercise of power could be tolerated, as long as the veil of sentiment covered it. And my last slide. The crisis then for liberalism found a refuge in law. In fact, specifically in human rights discourse, where the left felt it could engage the traditional politicians on a safe ground and talk among themselves as if they shared a common point of reference: the language of the law, the language of the Constitution, and the language of the Bill of Rights. What happens, however, and especially for my discipline, is that it positions the law as reason encoded in the doings and dreams of power. In other words, it celebrates the law as if it were the embodiment of reason, when in fact it is the embodiment of compromises, and dirty compromises at a deeper level. And which led to this author to say that, and I don't know if Dean Bacungan will agree with me, law professors are like priests who have lost their faith but kept their jobs.